If they killed me, the coroner would look for poison. But if they turned me into a breathing statue, nobody would ask a single question while they emptied my bank accounts. It took me 56 years to build a life worth stealing. I was a structural engineer by trade, a man who spent 4 decades reading blueprints, checking stress points, and making sure load-bearing walls didn't crumble under pressure. I built the 4-bedroom craftsman home on Oak Ridge Drive with my own hands. I laid the stone foundation, ran the copper wiring, and installed the solid oak beams in the living room ceiling. It was evaluated at $1.2 million, completely paid off. Add in my $800,000 retirement portfolio, 2 vehicles, and 40 acres of timberland up north, and I was worth considerably more alive than dead, provided I was in no position to say no. The betrayal didn't begin with a drawn weapon or a midnight scream. It began 6 weeks ago with a faint, almost unnoticeable tingling in the fingers of my left hand. I mentioned it over breakfast one morning, casually brushing my thumb across my fingertips. "Must have slept on my neck wrong," I said, reaching for my coffee mug. My wife, Victoria, stopped buttering her toast. She was 48, elegant, and possessed a quiet, practiced composure that I had spent 12 years mistaking for devotion. Across the granite island sat Chloe, her 24-year-old daughter from a previous marriage whom I had raised, put through college, and treated as my own flesh and blood. Victoria looked across the table at Chloe. The look lasted less than a second, a subtle, unspoken transmission between mother and daughter, before she turned back to me with a face full of overwhelming, suffocating concern. "Arthur, darling, you shouldn't ignore neurological symptoms," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "You've been working too hard in the yard. Chloe, call Dr. Vance's office right now and get him an emergency appointment." Dr. Marcus Vance, no relation to me, though he shared my last name, was a private neurosurgeon operating out of a sleek glass and steel clinic on the north side of the city. He wasn't the kind of doctor you saw for a routine checkup. He was the kind of doctor who took cash pay patients and didn't ask inconvenient questions. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in his dimly lit office staring at a backlit MRI monitor. Dr. Vance was a tall, angular man in his late 50s with cold gray eyes and pristine, manicured hands. He pointed a silver pen at a cross-section of a human neck. "Right here, Mr. Vance," the doctor said smoothly, tracing a dark shadow along the vertebrae. "Severe cervical spinal stenosis at the C4-C5 level. The spinal canal is narrowed to less than 4 millimeters. A single sudden movement, a minor fall, or even a hard sneeze could sever the nerve bundle, causing complete, irreversible cardiac arrest." I stared at the image. I was an engineer, I knew how to read scans. But something about the bone density on the monitor didn't match my build. The shoulders were too narrow, the clavicle line was slanted differently. "Is this my scan?" I asked, looking up. "The date on the header is cropped out." "Of course it's your scan, Arthur," Victoria interjected quickly, resting her hand heavily on my shoulder. Her fingers dug in just enough to feel like a grip rather than an embrace. "We need to schedule the corrective procedure immediately. Dr. Vance says he has an opening tomorrow morning at his private surgical center." "Tomorrow?" I hesitated. "I'd like a second opinion from the university hospital first." Dr. Vance folded his hands on his desk, his face setting into a stern, clinical mask. "Mr. Vance, if you walk out of this office without stabilization, I cannot legally or ethically take responsibility for what happens. If that nerve pinches fully while you're driving home, you'll be dead before your car hits the median." They booked the surgery for 7 a.m. the following morning. We returned home at 4 p.m. That evening, Victoria was unnaturally attentive. She cooked my favorite dinner, a rich beef stew, and brought me a glass of scotch in my study. I took 2 sips, but the liquid tasted vaguely bitter, leaving a chalky residue on the back of my tongue. Pretending to be engrossed in a blueprint on my drafting table, I poured the rest of the scotch into the pot of a ficus plant near the window when she stepped out of the room. By midnight, the house was dead silent. My mouth was bone dry, a residual effect of whatever mild sedative she had slipped into the glass. I swung my legs out of bed, keeping my movements silent, and crept down the carpeted hallway toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I passed the top of the basement stairs, I saw a thin line of light glowing beneath the door of Victoria's home office at the far end of the hall. I stopped. The house was cold, but I felt a sudden spike of heat behind my ears. I crept down the hallway, keeping my back pressed against the wood paneling, until I reached the cracked frame of her office door. Victoria was standing by the window, her back to me, holding her phone to her ear. Chloe sat on the leather couch nearby, reviewing a stack of legal documents with a yellow highlighter. "The deposit has already cleared your offshore account, Marcus," Victoria said into the receiver, her voice calm, measured, and stripped of every drop of emotion she had displayed at the clinic. $30,000 in cash. You'll receive the remaining $20,000 the moment the post-operative report is finalized. I froze. My breath caught in my throat like a piece of broken glass. "No," Victoria continued, pacing slowly behind her desk. "We are not changing the plan to a total cardiac arrest. A death triggers a mandatory county coroner investigation, an autopsy, and a toxicology screen. I'm not risking a forensic audit on his estate." Chloe looked up from her papers, her voice cold and completely devoid of empathy. "Mom, just make sure Dr. Vance cuts the nerve clean at C4. If he's paralyzed from the neck down, the court approves the full conservatorship automatically. He won't be able to speak to a lawyer, he won't be able to sign a revocation, and we control the power of attorney without a judge looking twice." "He won't be speaking to anyone," Victoria told the doctor on the line. "Once the procedure is done, we move him to the basement care suite. I've already hired a private night nurse who doesn't ask questions. By the time the bank notices the property transfers, Arthur will be sitting in a wheelchair staring at a wall." My chest seized. The floor beneath my feet felt like it was dissolving into open air. $30,000. They hadn't just hired a doctor to treat me, they had paid $30,000 of my own money to turn me into a living corpse. I stepped back from the door, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I had to get out of the house. I had my truck keys in my pocket, my phone in my hand, and 30 years of survival instincts screaming at me to run. I turned toward the front foyer, but as I reached the bottom of the stairs, my foot hit a loose floorboard. Victoria's voice cut through the darkness from behind me. I didn't answer. I sprinted for the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and threw it open into the freezing night air. I made it halfway down the driveway before Chloe's car, which had been parked strategically across the apron of the garage, blocked my path. She had run out the side door, key fob in hand, and slammed the automatic gates shut before I could reach my truck. Victoria walked down the stone steps toward me, wrapped in her silk robe, her phone still in her hand. She didn't panic. She didn't yell. She looked at me with the cold, calculating detachment of a slaughterhouse manager inspecting livestock. "You always were too smart for your own good, Arthur," she said softly, stepping closer. "But you're tired, your neck is failing you. Look how confused you are running out into the driveway in your bare feet." "I heard you," I rasped, my voice shaking. "I heard everything, Victoria, the 30,000, Dr. Vance. I'm calling the police." I pulled out my cell phone, but before my thumb could press the screen, Chloe stepped out from behind the hedge and struck the back of my knees with an iron fireplace poker. I collapsed onto the cold gravel. The impact sent a jolt of agony shooting up my spine. My phone flew from my hand, shattering against the stone wall. "He's having an episode," Victoria said smoothly into her phone, laying the groundwork for the paper trail as Chloe pinned my arms behind my back. "Yes, operator. My husband has severe cervical trauma and delusional dementia. He's trying to harm himself. We're bringing him directly to Dr. Vance's surgical center right now." They threw me into the back of Victoria's SUV. I fought, I kicked. I screamed until my throat was raw, but the sedatives in my blood were finally taking hold. My limbs grew heavy, my vision narrowed into a dark tunnel, and the last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was the glowing digital clock on the dashboard ticking toward 6 a.m. When I opened my eyes, I was lying under the harsh, fluorescent lights of an operating theater. My wrists and ankles were strapped tightly to a narrow metal table. Above me, A large, circular surgical mirror reflected the room in terrifying detail. I tried to scream, but a thick plastic bit had been strapped into my mouth, forcing my jaws apart and locking my tongue down. I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't move my head. It was locked into a heavy steel halo frame screwed directly into the sides of my skull. Dr. Marcus Vance stood over me, wearing full surgical scrubs, his face covered by a blue mask. Only his gray eyes were visible, cold, focused, and completely detached. Beside him stood a tray of polished steel scalpels, retractors, and nerve-cutting shears. Up in the glass observation gallery above the operating room, I saw two figures standing in the dim light. Victoria and Chloe. They were holding paper cups of coffee, watching me down below as if they were attending a theatrical performance. "Patient is conscious," a nurse noted from behind the anesthesia monitor. "Dr. Vance, his blood pressure is spiking. Should I increase the paralytic?" "No," Dr. Vance said calmly, picking up a heavy, short-bladed scalpel from the tray. "The anesthesia dose is sufficient to prevent deep muscle spasms. We need him awake enough for the neurological baseline check immediately following the incision." He wanted me to feel it. He wanted my brain to register the exact moment my body was erased. I looked up into the overhead mirror. I watched as Dr. Vance leaned over my neck, his gloved fingers feeling for the C4 vertebra at the base of my skull. $30,000, Arthur," Dr. Vance whispered softly, bending close to my ear so the nurses couldn't hear. "Your wife was very thorough. She wanted to make sure you were fully aware of what was happening, but completely incapable of ever telling anyone about it." I pulled against the leather restraints with everything I had, but my muscles were trapped in a vice-like paralysis. Tears of rage and terror leaked from the corners of my eyes, rolling down into my hair. I watched the overhead mirror as Dr. Vance lowered the tip of the scalpel to the skin over my spine. The cold steel touched my neck. Then came the cut. A blinding, white-hot line of agony tore through the back of my neck. It wasn't just physical pain, it was an electric shock that surged through my entire nervous system, burning out every signal line from my chin down to my toes. I tried to scream through the bit, but my lungs collapsed inward, unable to draw air. A mechanical ventilator beside the bed hissed violently, forcing a tube down my throat and pumping air into my chest for me. In the overhead mirror, I watched Dr. Vance reach into the incision with a pair of delicate silver shears. The world didn't go dark. That was the cruelest part. The pain simply vanished, replaced by a terrifying, hollow silence below my throat. My legs disappeared. My arms disappeared. My chest disappeared. I was no longer a man standing on his own 2 feet. I was a floating head, trapped inside a useless cage of bone and flesh. Dr. Vance stepped back, wiping a drop of blood from his gloved thumb. He looked up at the observation gallery and gave a single, professional nod. Up above, Victoria placed her coffee cup on the railing, turned to her daughter and smiled. The basement was cold. It didn't smell like the cedar and sawdust I had known for 20 years when this was my workshop. It smelled of bleach, medical-grade rubbing alcohol, and the faint, sweet stench of artificial lavender air freshener. I lay flat on my back in a specialized hospital bed, positioned directly in the center of the concrete floor. Above me, the exposed wooden joists I had sanded and sealed with my own hands looked like the ribcage of a dead ship. I couldn't turn my head to the left or the right. A rigid foam neck brace locked my jaw toward the ceiling, holding my gaze fixed on a square of water-stained drywall. Beside the bed, a mechanical ventilator hissed rhythmic, mechanical breaths hiss-click, pause, hiss-click, forcing cool air through a tracheostomy tube inserted directly into my throat. The basement door at the top of the stairs clicked open. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed down the wooden steps. Victoria stepped into my line of sight. She was wearing a tailored beige coat and holding a leather designer handbag bought with the credit card I had worked 40 years to keep clear. Behind her walked Chloe, wearing dark sunglasses pushed up onto her head and carrying a manila folder filled with legal documents. Victoria stopped at the side of my bed. She didn't look sad. She didn't look guilty. She reached out with 2 manicured fingers and lightly tapped the side of my face. I couldn't feel her touch below my jawline. My brain only registered the dull vibration against my cheekbone. "Good morning, Arthur," Victoria said, her voice smooth and sweet, as if she were greeting a pet. "You had a very long night. The doctor said the operation went as well as could be expected, given how severely damaged your spine was." I opened my mouth to scream, to call her a murderer, to spit in her face, but no sound came out. The air wasn't passing over my vocal cords. It was being routed through the plastic hose in my neck. My throat made a dry, wet clicking sound. "Don't strain yourself, darling," she continued, pulling a small silver laptop from her bag and setting it on the tray table over my chest. "You can't talk. Your vocal nerves suffered unfortunate collateral swelling during the decompression. Dr. Vance says it's permanent." Chloe stepped forward, opening the manila folder. "Mom, the notary will be here at 2 o'clock. We need the biometric authorization for the timberland deeds first." "Right, of course," Victoria said. She picked up my lifeless right hand. It was a strange, horrifying sensation watching a hand I had used to build houses, write blueprints, and hold my family float in the air as if it belonged to a mannequin. I felt no blood pumping through it, no warmth in the fingers. It was just a dead weight attached to my shoulder. Victoria pressed my right thumb against the small black biometric scanner plugged into her laptop. "First national transfer approved," Victoria read off the screen, her eyes lighting up with cold satisfaction. $400,000 from the primary savings into the family trust. "Now the pension account," Chloe urged, leaning over her mother's shoulder. "The lump sum withdrawal request needs his thumbprint and face ID." Victoria held my limp hand against the scanner again, while Chloe positioned a smartphone 2 inches from my eyes. "Look right at the camera, Arthur," Chloe whispered, her face inches from mine. She smelled like expensive perfume, the kind I had bought her for her last birthday. "Open your eyes wide. Don't ruin the facial recognition, or I'll have the nurse turn off your suction tube for an hour." I tried to squeeze my eyes shut, to fight the camera, but Victoria used her thumb to prop my right eyelid open. Beep click. "Identity verified," the phone's artificial voice chimed. "Transferring $820,000. "That's it," Chloe laughed softly, clapping her hands together. "The house, the land, and the liquidity. We're fully clear." Victoria closed the laptop and smoothed down her coat. She looked down at me, her eyes dead and empty. "You built a good life for us, Arthur. It's just a shame you thought you were going to stick around to enjoy it. The night nurse will be here at 6 to change your catheter. Try not to make a mess." They walked up the stairs, leaving me alone in the dim, fluorescent hum of the basement. The night nurse arrived at 6 p.m. Her name was Elena. She was a stocky woman in her late 40s, dressed in faded navy scrubs, carrying a heavy canvas bag of medical supplies. Unlike Victoria, who moved through the room like a ghost inspecting an asset, Elena walked in with heavy, practical footsteps. "All right, Mr. Vance," Elena said softly, setting her bag on the metal chair. "Let's get your vitals checked." She was quiet, professional, and efficient, but as she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my upper arm, Victoria stepped out from the shadowy corner near the stairs. "Nurse Elena," Victoria said, her hands folded in front of her. "My husband's condition is extremely delicate. He suffers from severe, violent medical hallucinations caused by his brain trauma. He may try to blink or move his eyes to get your attention." "I understand, Mrs. Vance," Elena replied without looking up from the blood pressure gauge. "I need to be very clear with you," Victoria continued, stepping closer and dropping a thick white envelope onto the tray table. "There is an extra $2,000 in cash in that envelope every month. In exchange, you administer his 10 mg lorazepam injection every 4 hours without fail. He is not to have visitors. He is not to be given any communication boards. If I catch you allowing him to interact with anyone, I will report your license to the State Board for Narcotics Theft." Elena looked at the envelope. Her jaw tightened slightly, but she nodded slowly. "I take my orders from the attending physician, Mrs. Vance." "Dr. Vance wrote the order himself," Victoria smiled thinly. "The sedatives keep him comfortable, keep him asleep." When Victoria finally went upstairs and locked the basement door behind her, the silence returned, broken only by the rhythmic hiss-click of my ventilator. Elena stood over my bed, preparing the syringe. She wiped the rubber stopper of the IV port with an alcohol swab. I stared at her. I couldn't move my body, but I poured every ounce of human agony, terror, and consciousness into my eyes. I widened them, tracking her every movement, desperate to break through the narrative Victoria had built. Elena stopped. Her thumb rested on the plunger of the syringe. She looked down at my face, noticing the rapid, desperate flutter of my eyelids. "You're in there, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machine. I blinked once. A hard, deliberate, heavy blink. Elena leaned in closer, her brow furrowed. She looked toward the basement stairs to make sure the door was closed, then looked back at me. "Mrs. Vance said you don't register language anymore." I blinked twice. "No." She set the syringe down on the metal tray. "Can you hear me clearly?" I blinked once. "Yes." Elena took a sharp breath, leaning over the guardrail of the bed. "Listen to me, Arthur. I'm going to run a code with you. 1 blink for yes, 2 blinks for no. Do you understand?" I blinked once. "Yes." "Are you in pain?" 2 blinks. "No." The paralysis had killed the pain, replacing it with a terrifying void. "Did Dr. Vance perform this surgery with your consent?" 2 blinks. "No." Elena's eyes widened. She reached out and felt the base of my neck where the surgical dressing was wrapped tightly. "They told me you had an emergency collapse, that you signed the consent form in the ER." I blinked twice frantically, tears welling in the corners of my eyes and spilling down into my ears. I began blinking rapidly in a sequence I hoped she would recognize: 3 quick blinks, 3 long blinks, 3 quick blinks. SOS. Elena stepped back, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at the syringe filled with lorazepam, then looked at the IV line running into my neck. "If I don't give you this sedative, your blood pressure will spike and the monitors upstairs will alarm," she whispered nervously. "Victoria checks the telemetry app on her phone every 2 hours. She paused, staring at the white envelope filled with hush money on the table. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, Elena picked up the syringe. But instead of injecting it into my line, she squirted the clear liquid out into the sink basin near the wall. She filled a new, sterile syringe with plain, normal saline and injected it into my IV port. "This will clear your system in 12 hours, Elena whispered, bending down so her lips were inches from my ear. "If your brain wasn't damaged by the stroke, your nerves are going to start fighting the paralytic as the heavy sedatives flush out. It's going to burn like fire, Arthur, but you have to stay completely still. If they see you move a single muscle before we have proof, they will kill you for real." She looked at me with fierce, quiet determination. "I'm going to get into her office tonight." By 3 a.m., the house upstairs was pitch black. Down in the basement, the saline drip was flushing months of built-up chemical fog from my bloodstream. For the first time since the operation, my brain felt razor-sharp, and with that clarity came the horror of what was happening to my body. Elena slipped off her rubber-soled shoes and crept silently toward the basement stairs. She carried a small pocket flashlight and a blank USB drive. "Stay still," she whispered to me before stepping onto the bottom rung. "If you hear me fall or scream, do not react." I watched her vanish up the wooden steps. The door at the top clicked open with a tiny, agonizing squeak that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Minutes stretched into eternity. The mechanical ventilator kept time hiss-click, counting down the seconds of my captivity. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. Suddenly, a burning sensation shot through the tip of my right big toe. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't phantom pain. It was a searing, white-hot needle of sensation that traveled up my calf, through my knee, and settled in my hip. My nervous system was waking up. Dr. Vance had made a critical mistake in his rush to take Victoria's $30,000. He had cut the primary spinal tract, but he had missed the collateral nerve pathway on my right side. I squeezed my right fist in my mind. Nothing happened physically, but deep beneath the dead skin, a microscopic spark fired. Above me, a door slammed shut upstairs. Footsteps rushed down the hallway. Elena came flying down the basement stairs, her face pale, her breathing ragged. She pulled the basement door shut and locked the deadbolt just as heavy footsteps sounded on the floorboards directly above us. "I found it," Alina gasped, running to the side of my bed. She pulled the USB drive from her pocket and held it up to the dim light. She kept the original medical records in a safe behind her desk. The real MRI scan from the university hospital, the one showing your spine, was completely healthy before the surgery. "What else?" I tried to ask with my eyes, blinking rapidly. "I found the wire transfer receipt," Alina whispered, her voice shaking with rage. $30,000 paid to Vance Neurosurgical Consultants, LLC, signed by Victoria 3 hours before you were brought into the clinic. And the draft contract for the sale of this house. They're selling it to a private developer for $700,000 cash. The closing is in 3 days. Suddenly, the lock on the basement door above us clicked. The door swung open. Victoria stood at the top of the stairs, wearing a silk robe, holding a small silver handgun, a .22 caliber pistol I had bought her for home defense 6 years ago. Beside her stood Chloe, holding her phone with the flashlight turned on. "I thought I heard footsteps, Nurse Alina," Victoria said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal coldness. She began walking down the stairs, one slow step at a time, keeping the gun pointed directly at Alina's chest. "I checked the security camera outside my office. You were inside for 4 minutes. "You're a monster," Alina said, stepping in front of my bed to block Victoria's line of sight. "I have the real MRI file on this drive. I have the wire transfer. The police are going to put you away for the rest of your life." Victoria stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She didn't look frightened. She looked annoyed, like a woman who had encountered a minor inconvenience in her schedule. "The police won't see that drive, Alina," Victoria said smoothly. She raised the pistol. "Because you're about to have a tragic accident. An unstable, drug-addicted nurse who tried to rob a paralyzed man, got caught, and died in a struggle over a firearm." Chloe stepped around her mother, pulling a pair of heavy leather-work gloves from her coat pocket. "Do it now, Mom. The transport van for the offshore care facility arrives at 6 a.m. anyway. We can just tell the drivers he died of cardiac arrest during the night." Victoria took 2 steps toward Alina, taking aim. Down beneath the thin cotton bedsheet, hidden from their sight, my right hand twitched. The nerve line was open. But my body was still a heavy, reluctant weight. Fire coursed down my right side, a agonizing, pins and needles sensation as dormant pathways violently reconnected. Every inch of my right arm felt as if it were being submerged in boiling oil, but I couldn't afford to wince. I couldn't afford to let a single muscle in my face betray the revolt happening beneath the sheet. Alina didn't hesitate. Realizing Victoria meant every word, she lunged sideways, slamming her shoulder into Chloe to create a split-second distraction. The gun went off. The crack of the .22 pistol echoed like a cannon in the enclosed concrete basement. The bullet missed Alina, ricocheting off the concrete floor and embedding itself into the wooden frame of my workbench across the room. Chloe shrieked, stumbling back into the metal supply rack, sending glass vials and trays crashing to the ground. "Get her!" Victoria screamed, swinging the barrel back toward Alina, who had scrambled behind the heavy steel support beam near the stairs. Victoria took 3 fast, aggressive steps forward, passing right along the edge of my bed. She was so focused on cornering Alina that she didn't look down. She didn't notice my right hand sliding out from under the cotton sheet. I didn't have total control. My fingers felt thick, clumsy, and detached, but 30 years of mechanical intuition guided my grip. As Victoria raised the gun to shoot around the support pillar, my right hand shot up, wrapping around her thin, silk-clad ankle with every ounce of strength my reawakened right side could summon. My grip locked like a steel wrench. Victoria gasped in absolute horror, a guttural, terrified sound as she looked down and met my eyes. She didn't see a helpless, comatose patient anymore. She saw a man returning from the grave. What she choked out. I didn't let go. I yanked her leg toward the bed with a violent, spastic jerk of my shoulder. Her footing gave way completely. She hit the edge of the metal bed frame with a sickening thud before crashing face first onto the hard concrete floor. The gun flew from her hand, skittering across the room and sliding straight beneath the heavy cast-iron furnace in the corner. "Mom!" Chloe screamed, rushing forward. Elena didn't waste the opening. She sprinted out from behind the pillar, grabbed a heavy glass IV pole, and swung it with all her weight, catching Chloe square across the collarbone. Chloe let out a sharp cry and collapsed onto her side, clutching her shoulder on the floor. Victoria scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her nose bleeding, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as she stared at me. My right arm was shaking violently, elevated above the bed, my fingers opening and closing as the neural feedback flooded my brain. "You're paralyzed," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling, her mask of cold control completely shattered. "Dr. Vance, he cut the nerve. I watched him cut it." I couldn't speak, the tracheostomy tube still locked my voice, but I leaned my head forward, my neck muscles straining against the foam brace, and fixed her with a glare so cold it made her back into the wall. Elena stood over Victoria, the heavy IV pole raised, the USB drive tightly clutched in her other hand. "Get up," Elena commanded, her voice ringing out in the cold air. "Both of you, against the workbench. Now." Victoria looked toward the stairs, then at the gun trapped under the furnace, and finally at me, watching my right hand slowly reach down and pull the ventilator tube from my collar. Air hissed wildly from the open machine, but I was breathing on my own now, shallow and ragged, through my mouth. $30,000, I rasped through the raw, ruined tissue of my throat. It was barely a whisper, a hollow, scraping sound from the depths of my chest, but it hit the room like a thunderclap. Victoria's jaw dropped. She shrank back against the wall, clutching her bleeding face. "You forgot one thing, Victoria," I whispered, every word an agonizing effort as my right arm reached for the metal bedside tray, gripping the sharp surgical scissors Elena had left behind. "An engineer always builds a backup system." Elena kept the pole leveled at them while pulling her personal phone from her pocket with her left hand. She dialed 3 digits and pressed speakerphone. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice boomed through the quiet basement. "My name is Elena Vance, home health nurse," Elena said clearly, staring down at Victoria and Chloe. "I am at 412 Oak Ridge Drive. I need armed officers and an ambulance immediately. I have a restrained perpetrator who attempted a murder-for-hire estate fraud, a corrupt surgeon's medical records, and 2 women held at gunpoint." Victoria closed her eyes, tears of panic finally spilling down her cheeks as she realized the offshore accounts, the property deeds, and the entire life she had built on my destruction were evaporating in real time. Outside, in the distance beyond the high basement windows, the first faint wail of police sirens began to slice through the freezing night air. The sirens drew closer, their red and blue strobe lights reflecting off the high, frosted basement windows and casting long, erratic shadows across the concrete floor. Victoria sat collapsed against the base of my old wooden workbench, her silk robe stained with blood and concrete dust. All the poise, the icy calculating composure, and the quiet arrogance had dissolved into pathetic, breathless panic. Beside her, Chloe cradled her fractured collarbone, sobbing quietly into her knees, unable to look me in the eye. Elena stood guard near the foot of the wooden stairs, holding the heavy metal IV pole across her chest like a spear. Upstairs, the front door was shattered inward with a heavy, metallic crunch. "Police! State troopers! Clear the ground floor!" Heavy boots thundered across the hardwood ceilings above our heads, the very oak beams I had laid 2 decades ago. "Down here," Elena shouted, her voice echoing up the stairwell. "In the basement, we need medical personnel and armed officers." Within seconds, 4 officers rushed down the wooden steps, weapons raised, tactical flashlights cutting through the dim fluorescent haze. "Hands where we can see them. Don't move," a senior officer shouted, sweeping his firearm from Victoria to Chloe. Victoria immediately raised her arms, her face twisting into a desperate, practiced expression of victimhood. "Officer, thank God," she sobbed hysterically. "Help us, the nurse." The nurse snapped. "She attacked my daughter and tried to rob us." The lead officer looked at Victoria, then at Chloe, and finally turned his flashlight toward the center of the room, landing on me. I was propped up on my right elbow in the hospital bed, the mechanical ventilator hissing uselessly behind me. My right hand was held out, holding the surgical scissors, while my left side remained limp and unmoving. "Officer," Elena said calmly, stepping backward and laying the IV pole on the floor. She pulled the black USB drive and her phone from her scrub pocket, holding them out. "My name is Elena. I am the registered night nurse. On this drive are altered surgical records, an illegal $30,000 offshore wire transfer receipt, and audio recordings proving that woman paid Dr. Marcus Vance to intentionally paralyze her husband for estate control." The officer looked down at the drive, then at my face. "Arthur?" he asked softly, stepping closer to the bed. It was Deputy Mercer, a local deputy who used to patrol my neighborhood and whom I had known for 8 years. "Arthur Vance. Is this true?" I looked Mercer square in the eyes. I forced my raw, ruined vocal cords to work, dragging air past the surgical wound in my neck. "Check. Her office safe," I rasped, every syllable sounding like grinding stones. "The real MRI is inside. 30,000. Cash to Vance." Mercer's face hardened. He looked back at Victoria, whose frantic lies died instantly in her throat. She looked at Mercer, then at me, realizing the deputy knew my voice and knew I was entirely sane. "Cuff them," Mercer ordered his deputies coldly. "Get paramedics down here for Mr. Vance immediately." Victoria screamed as the steel cuffs snapped around her wrists. "Arthur, please. You don't understand. They forced me. Vance threatened us," she shrieked as they dragged her up the wooden stairs. Chloe wept hysterically, pulled along behind her mother, her designer clothes torn and covered in dust. I lay back against the thin pillow, watching their shadows vanish up the stairwell for the last time. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my study at Oak Ridge Drive. I sat in a custom leather armchair behind my drafting table. My left leg was held in a lightweight brace, and my left arm rested in a dark sling, but my right side was fully functional. The doctors at the University Medical Center called my recovery a medical miracle. I called it the sheer, unyielding refusal to let a murderer win. On the corner of my desk sat 3 heavy manila folders. The first contained the federal conviction notices. Victoria and Chloe were currently serving 22-year sentences at a maximum security state facility for conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, and grand estate fraud. Dr. Marcus Vance's medical license had been permanently revoked, his clinic seized by the federal government, and he was serving 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The second folder contained the court-ordered restitution papers, restoring every cent of my pension, timberland, and liquid assets back to my name. The third folder contained a fresh deed to the property, signed in bold, black ink by my own right hand. A soft knock sounded at the open study door. Elena stood in the hallway, dressed in casual clothes, carrying 2 mugs of fresh coffee. She had resigned from home care and was now managing a patient advocacy clinic I helped fund. "How are the nerves feeling today, Arthur?" she asked, setting a mug on my desk. "They burn," I said, offering a tight, genuine smile as I reached out with my right hand and picked up the heavy porcelain cup. "Every single morning. But the doctor says pain means the pathways are still fighting." "And the house?" She looked around the quiet, sunlit room. I looked at the solid oak beams overhead, then down at the drafting paper spread out before me. "I'm keeping it," I said softly, taking a sip of coffee. "I built every wall in this place to withstand a storm. It took $30,000 to lock me inside my own skin, but they forgot to check if the foundation was made of stone.